Chosen one, this was never just a relationship problem. The moment your divine union was written into destiny, it became a target. And the terrifying part is the attacks didn't always come from strangers. Some came through betrayal. Some came through separation. Some came through the people you trusted most. Have you ever wondered why every time you got close to real love, chaos suddenly appeared? Why misunderstandings exploded out of nowhere? Why people started turning against you for no reason? That was not random. Because your twin flame connection carries a frequency powerful enough to break generational curses, awaken dormant gifts, and destroy karmic cycles that were never meant to survive your union. And forces that feed on fear cannot survive where divine love exists. So they tried to delay you, distract you, exhaust you. But here's what they never expected. The separation did not destroy your divine union. It activated it. Chosen one, this message is not appearing in your life by accident. There is a reason you clicked on this video tonight. There is a reason your spirit felt pulled toward these words, even when your logical mind could not. Explain why. And before this message ends, something deep inside you is going to finally understand why your life has felt so heavy for so long. Because what you have been experiencing was never just ordinary heartbreak. It was spiritual resistance. The moment your divine union was written into destiny, opposition began forming around it. Not because you were weak, but because your connection carries something dangerous to the systems. Built on fear, manipulation, and emotional control. Your union was never ordinary love. It was transformational love. And transformational love threatens everything false. Think about your life for a moment. Really think about it. Why did chaos always seem to appear the moment you started healing? Why did people suddenly misunderstand you after you began awakening spiritually? Why did certain relationships collapse right when you thought things were finally improving? Why did you feel an invisible weight every time you moved closer to peace? Chosen one, those patterns were not random. Most people go through relationships that simply teach lessons, but your soul contract is different. Your connection was designed to awaken two people at the deepest spiritual level possible. And because of that, every unresolved wound, every hidden fear, every karmic attachment had to rise to the surface before reunion could happen. That is why your journey became painful. Not because you were cursed, but because your soul was being prepared. And here is the part most people are not ready to hear. The attacks against your divine union did not always come in obvious ways. Sometimes they came disguised as distractions. Sometimes they came through toxic relationships that drained your spirit. Sometimes they came through people who mocked your intuition and made you question your sanity. And sometimes they came through the very people you loved the most. Have you noticed how certain individuals seemed uncomfortable whenever you started becoming stronger? Whenever you began setting boundaries? Whenever you started protecting your peace? It is because broken systems benefit from broken versions of you. As long as you stayed insecure, emotionally exhausted, and disconnected from your purpose, you were easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to keep trapped inside cycles that were never aligned with your destiny. But something changed recently, didn't it? You may still feel confused. You may still have emotional scars. You may still wake up some nights feeling lonely without understanding why. But deep down, something inside you no longer fits the old life. The conversations feel empty. The fake relationships feel unbearable. The constant drama feels exhausting. And even though part of you misses certain people, another part of you knows you cannot go backward anymore. That feeling is not depression. That feeling is spiritual separation from lower frequencies. Your soul is beginning to reject environments that no longer match your future. And that transition can feel terrifying. Because when the universe starts removing people, habits, and emotional attachments from your life, it often happens before your blessings arrive. That is why so many chosen ones misinterpret the season before reunion. They think they're being abandoned. But in reality, they're being repositioned. Listen carefully. Every time you almost settled for less, something fell apart. Every time you ignored your intuition, chaos followed. Every time you tried to force a connection that was not aligned, your spirit became exhausted. Why? Because your soul already knew there was someone tied to your destiny at a higher level. A person who would not just love you emotionally, but awaken you spiritually. And that kind of connection cannot enter a life still filled with unresolved karmic cycles. So the universe began clearing the path. Painfully. Slowly. Strategically. That explains why certain endings hurt far more than they should have. It explains why some betrayals changed you forever. It explains why you felt spiritually attacked after certain breakups. Because those experiences were not only emotional, they were energetic. There are people watching this right now who have spent years blaming themselves for relationships that were never meant to survive. You thought you failed. You thought you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too deep, too spiritual. But what if the real problem was that your soul could no longer tolerate surface-level connections? What if your spirit was rejecting anything that could not meet you at the level of your destiny? Chosen one, hear this clearly. You were never difficult to love. You were difficult to manipulate. And there is a massive difference. That is why your awakening triggered so many reactions from others. Some people became jealous. Some became distant. Some tried to shame you back into smaller versions of yourself. And some unconsciously projected their own darkness onto you because your growth forced them to confront what they had avoided within themselves. But despite everything that tried to stop you, you survived. Even after the betrayals. Even after the abandonment. Even after crying alone while nobody understood what you were carrying internally. You survived seasons that should have broken you. And the reason you survived is because your purpose is still alive. Your union is still alive. Your destiny is still active. Right now, many chosen ones are entering a powerful transition period. This is the stage where old karmic contracts begin collapsing rapidly. You may notice sudden endings happening around you. People disappearing unexpectedly. Friendships fading. Career paths changing. Emotional purging intensifying. Strange dreams becoming more frequent. And moments where you feel your twin flame's energy so strongly that it almost scares you. This is happening because the energetic distance between you and your divine union is shrinking. And whenever divine alignment gets closer, resistance often becomes louder before it disappears completely. That is why you must stop interpreting temporary chaos as permanent failure. The storm was never proof that you were cursed. The storm was proof that something significant was approaching. Think about a plane before takeoff. There is vibration, pressure, acceleration, discomfort. Everything shakes before elevation happens. And spiritually, the same thing is happening in your life right now. You are not falling apart. You are breaking out of an identity that can no longer carry your future. The old version of you was built through survival, but the new version of you is being built through alignment. That is why your spirit has become more sensitive lately. You can feel fake energy faster. You notice manipulation immediately. You no longer crave validation the way you once did. And although this transformation feels lonely at times, it is actually evidence that your soul is remembering who you truly are. You are not here to chase temporary love. You are here to experience sacred alignment. A connection capable of healing bloodlines. A connection capable of activating dormant spiritual gifts. A connection capable of teaching both souls what unconditional love truly means. And yes, that level of love becomes a target, because anything capable of awakening human consciousness threatens systems built on fear. But hear this carefully, chosen one. What is divinely protected cannot be permanently destroyed. Delayed? Yes. Tested? Absolutely. Purified? Without question. But destroyed? Never. The separation was not punishment. The delays were not rejection. And the silence was not abandonment. It was preparation. Because the version of you that enters divine union cannot be the same version of you that once accepted emotional crumbs, betrayal, and spiritual confusion. You had to awaken first. And now, you finally are. Chosen one of the deepest wounds you carry is not just heartbreak. It is the pain of being misunderstood your entire life. Long before the spiritual awakening. Long before the twin flame journey. Long before you started questioning why your soul felt different from everyone around you. You already sensed it. You were never fully accepted for who you truly were. From an early age, many of you felt emotionally different from the people around you. While others could easily blend into crowds, follow trends, or ignore their intuition, you always felt something deeper moving inside you. You noticed energies. You sensed hidden emotions in people's voices. You could feel tension in a room before anyone spoke. You carried empathy in a world that rewarded emotional numbness. And because of that, life became heavy very early. Some of you grew up in homes where love felt conditional. You were praised when you stayed quiet, accepted when you ignored your own needs, loved only when you made yourself smaller for others. And the moment you expressed your truth, everything changed. People called you too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. But what they called sensitivity was actually spiritual awareness. You were seeing things other people were afraid to confront. That is why so many chosen ones spent years doubting themselves. Not because they lacked wisdom, but because they were surrounded by people who invalidated their inner knowing. Think about how many times your intuition warned you about someone before your mind could explain. Why? You felt the manipulation. You sensed the dishonesty. You recognized the hidden jealousy. But because you wanted to believe the best in people, you ignored your spirit and gave chance after chance after chance. And every time, your soul paid the price. Chosen one, this is important. Your heart was never weak for loving deeply. It was simply unprotected. You gave people access to sacred parts of yourself because you believed everyone carried the same intentions you did. But many people approached love through ego, fear, control, or emotional dependency. While you approached it through authenticity, that mismatch created enormous pain in your life. And if we are honest, some of your deepest wounds did not come from enemies. They came from people you trusted, people you defended, people you sacrificed for. There are viewers listening right now who spent years pouring love into family members who never truly saw them. You tried to earn acceptance by overgiving, by fixing everyone's problems, by becoming emotionally available for people who were never emotionally available for you. And somewhere along the journey, you forgot to ask yourself one painful question. Who is pouring back into me? That realization breaks many chosen ones during awakening. Because eventually, you begin recognizing that you were surviving relationships built entirely on imbalance. You carried conversations. You carried emotional labor. You carried loyalty. You carried forgiveness. And you carried hope long after other people stopped caring. No wonder you became exhausted. No wonder your soul started withdrawing from people. No wonder loneliness began feeling safer than connection. You were spiritually depleted. And the hardest part is that most people around you never understood the depth of what you were carrying internally. They saw your silence, but not your battles. They saw your kindness, but not your sacrifices. They saw your strength, but not the emotional storms you survived privately. Chosen one, many of you became masters at hiding pain. You learned to smile while breaking internally. You learned to comfort others while silently needing comfort yourself. You learned to act fine because experience taught you that vulnerability was often met with dismissal. And eventually, you stopped expecting people to truly understand you at all. That isolation became part of your identity. Even in crowded rooms, you felt alone. Even in relationships, you felt emotionally unseen. Even while helping others heal, you secretly wondered why nobody ever stayed long enough to heal you. That question haunted your spirit for years. Why do I always give more than I receive? And the answer is painful but liberating. Because your soul was never designed to permanently remain in one-sided connections. Those relationships were classrooms, not destinations. They came to teach you discernment, boundaries, self-worth, energetic protection, and most importantly, they came to teach you the difference between being needed and being loved. Many chosen ones confuse those two things. People needed your healing energy, needed your empathy, needed your patience, needed your emotional support. But very few people knew how to truly love you in return. Because real love requires emotional maturity. And emotionally immature people often resent what they cannot control. That is why some people became uncomfortable when you started changing. Have you noticed that? The moment you stopped tolerating disrespect, certain people pulled away. The moment you started protecting your peace, some accused you of becoming cold. The moment you stopped chasing approval, others became defensive or distant. Why? Because your transformation disrupted the version of you they benefited from. Broken people often panic when they lose access to someone who once carried their emotional burdens. But your soul is no longer willing to abandon itself for acceptance. And that shift is sacred. Still, healing from these wounds is not easy. Because even after awakening, part of you still remembers the pain of rejection. Part of you still fears abandonment. Part of you still wonders whether love will eventually disappear the moment you fully reveal your authentic self. That fear did not come from nowhere. It came from years of emotional conditioning. Years of feeling unseen. Years of shrinking yourself so others could remain comfortable. But hear this carefully, chosen one. The people who misunderstood you were never the final confirmation of your worth. They were temporary characters in a much larger spiritual story. Your soul has always been rare. That is why ordinary connections could never fully satisfy you. You were not searching for surface-level attraction. You were searching for resonance, depth, truth, safety, spiritual recognition. And because those things are rare, your journey often became lonely. Many nights, you questioned yourself. You wondered if maybe you were asking for too much. Maybe wanting honesty was unrealistic. Maybe wanting emotional depth was impossible. Maybe wanting soul-level love only existed in fantasies. But the truth is your soul remembered something your mind kept trying to forget. You were never meant for ordinary love. And ordinary people could sense that about you immediately. That is why some were drawn to you obsessively. And why others became intimidated by your energy without understanding why. Your presence forced people to confront themselves. Some healed around you. Some awakened around you. And some ran from themselves the moment your light exposed what they were hiding internally. But none of that means you were unlovable. In fact, your depth is precisely what makes your divine union so powerful. Because your twin flame journey is not built on performance. It is built on recognition. For the first time in your life, someone will see the parts of you that others overlooked. The emotional depth, the spiritual sensitivity, the hidden scars, the strength behind your silence. And instead of fearing those parts of you, they will understand them. That is why the journey required so much preparation first. Because after years of being misunderstood, your soul had to relearn trust. You had to stop confusing chaos with passion. You had to stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. You had to stop believing love required suffering. And perhaps most importantly, you had to stop abandoning yourself just to keep others comfortable. That lesson changes everything. Because once a chosen one finally understands their value, the entire energetic pattern shifts. You stop begging for attention. You stop forcing connections. You stop shrinking your spirit to fit spaces that were never designed for your growth. And suddenly, people who once overlooked you begin noticing your absence. Not because you became cruel, but because your energy is no longer leaking into places that drained you. You are reclaiming yourself. That is why this season feels so strange. Part of you is grieving old attachments. But another part of you is finally breathing for the first time in years. You are beginning to realize that loneliness was never your curse. Misalignment was. And now the universe is separating you from everything that cannot accompany you into your next chapter. Yes, it hurts. Yes, some nights still feel unbearably heavy. But your spirit is no longer asleep. You can feel the difference now. The old version of you tolerated emotional confusion because it feared abandonment. The new version of you would rather stand alone than betray its own soul again. That is evolution. That is awakening. And that is precisely why your divine union is getting closer. Because the moment you stopped begging the world to understand you, you finally began understanding yourself. Chosen one, there is something you must finally understand about your past relationships. They were never random. Not the betrayals. Not the abandonment. Not the false promises. Not even the relationships that completely shattered your heart. Every person who entered your life carried a lesson your soul needed before divine union could fully activate. And the painful truth is many of those lessons could only be learned through heartbreak. For years, you blamed yourself for the endings. You replayed conversations in your mind. You questioned your worth. You wondered whether you loved too deeply, trusted too easily, or expected too much from people who were incapable of meeting you emotionally. But what if those relationships were never designed to last? What if they were spiritual mirrors instead of permanent destinations? Chosen one, many of the people you loved were karmic connections, not soul-aligned partners. And there is a major difference between the two. Karmic relationships often begin with intense attraction, emotional obsession, and overwhelming chemistry. They feel magnetic, addictive, impossible to ignore. But beneath the intensity, there is instability, confusion, emotional inconsistency, fear, push and pull dynamics. One moment you feel deeply loved, and the next moment you feel emotionally abandoned. One day they seem fully committed, and the next they become distant, cold, or impossible to reach. These connections activate unresolved wounds because their purpose is not comfort. Their purpose is exposure. Karmic partners expose the pain you have been carrying unconsciously for years. The fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection, the fear of not being enough, the fear that love always disappears. And because those wounds already existed inside you, these relationships felt painfully familiar. That is why so many chosen ones repeatedly attract emotionally unavailable people before awakening. Your soul was unconsciously trying to heal old wounds through familiar patterns. You thought you were chasing love, but often you were chasing emotional resolution. Think about your past honestly. How many times did you ignore red flags because you feared losing the connection? How many times did your intuition warn you, but your loneliness convinced you to stay? How many times did you settle for half-hearted love because part of you believed that was all you deserved? Chosen one, your soul remembers every moment you abandoned yourself trying to keep someone else. And those moments created deep energetic exhaustion. Because nothing drains the spirit faster than pretending not to notice what your intuition already knows. Some of you stayed in relationships where communication disappeared, but you kept making excuses. Some stayed where loyalty was one-sided. Some stayed where manipulation slowly destroyed your self-esteem. And some stayed because the connection felt spiritually intense, even though emotionally it was destroying you. That confusion happens often on the spiritual journey. Many people mistake emotional chaos for soul connection. But true divine love does not require you to constantly betray your peace. Yes, twin flame journeys can involve separation and deep transformation. But there is a difference between a sacred connection triggering healing and a toxic relationship, consuming your spirit entirely. Your awakening begins the moment you stop romanticizing suffering. Because love was never meant to make you feel worthless. And one of the hardest lessons chosen ones must learn is this: intensity is not always alignment. Sometimes trauma creates attachment that feels spiritual simply because the emotions are overwhelming. The highs feel euphoric. The lows feel devastating. And your nervous system becomes addicted to emotional unpredictability. That cycle can feel impossible to escape, especially for souls who spent childhood earning love through survival, overgiving, or emotional sacrifice. You learned very early that love required proving yourself. So later in life, You unconsciously chased people who made you fight for affection. You confused emotional inconsistency with passion. You confused anxiety with connection. And because your soul was deeply loyal, you kept hoping wounded people would eventually choose you fully. But many of those people were never capable of loving you at the level your spirit required. Not because you were too much, but because they had not healed themselves. Unhealed people often receive love as pressure instead of safety. Your depth intimidated people who were still running from themselves. That is why some relationships collapsed the moment you became emotionally honest. The moment you asked for clarity. The moment you stopped accepting breadcrumbs. The moment you started valuing yourself. Suddenly, the connection changed. Why? Because karmic relationships survive through imbalance. Once you stop abandoning yourself, the unhealthy dynamic can no longer continue the same way. And although those endings hurt deeply, many of them were divine protection in disguise. Imagine where your life would be if some of those relationships had lasted forever. Imagine remaining trapped inside cycles of betrayal, emotional confusion, or constant insecurity for the rest of your life. Your soul was meant for more than survival love. You were meant for sacred alignment. But before your spirit could receive that level of connection, it had to release distorted beliefs about love itself. That is why the universe kept repeating lessons until you finally understood them. Some of you experienced the same relationship in different bodies. Different faces. Different names. Same emotional pattern. One person abandoned you emotionally. The next person abandoned you physically. Another betrayed your trust. Another disappeared without explanation. And after enough repetition, your soul finally began asking the deeper question. Why does this pattern keep happening to me? That question marks the beginning of awakening. Because once you stop blaming individual people alone, you begin recognizing the deeper energetic cycle underneath the experiences. The cycle was not punishment. It was preparation. Every heartbreak revealed something that still needed healing inside you. Not because you caused the mistreatment, but because unresolved wounds influence what we tolerate. And chosen ones often tolerate far too much before awakening. You forgave people who never apologized. You carried relationships alone. You stayed loyal to people who repeatedly betrayed your trust. You saw potential in people who refused to grow. And all of that came from the beautiful but dangerous depth of your heart. You wanted to heal people with love. But eventually your soul had to learn a painful spiritual truth. You cannot heal someone who is committed to remaining broken. That realization changes everything. Because once you understand that, you stop trying to save everyone. You stop draining yourself proving your worth. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people hoping they will suddenly become ready. And for many chosen ones, this stage feels lonely at first. Because healing often requires walking away from familiar pain. Even unhealthy connections can feel comforting when they are familiar. But familiarity is not destiny. And chaos is not love. The universe had to separate you from people who could not accompany you into your next chapter. That is why certain endings happen suddenly. That is why some people vanished without closure. That is why your spirit eventually became exhausted every time you tried reconnecting with relationships that no longer aligned. Your soul knew it was time to move forward long before your emotions were ready. And yes, some nights that process nearly destroyed you. There were nights you cried wondering why love always seemed temporary. Nights where abandonment reopened wounds you thought had already healed. Nights where silence felt unbearable because you desperately wanted answers. But even during those moments, something sacred was happening beneath the pain. Your soul was breaking addiction to emotional suffering. Little by little, you were learning to choose yourself, to protect your energy, to stop settling for inconsistent love, to stop begging people to recognize your value. That transformation is one of the most important stages before divine union. Because the version of you that accepts breadcrumbs cannot sustain sacred love. You had to become emotionally honest first. You had to stop confusing loneliness with lack. You had to realize that being alone is far less painful than remaining connected to people who slowly destroy your spirit. And now, something inside you has changed forever. You can feel it. You no longer crave the same chaotic dynamics. You no longer feel attracted to emotional games the way you once did. You no longer want temporary validation disguised as intimacy. Your spirit wants peace now. Depth, truth, consistency. And that shift is not accidental. It is evidence that your soul is preparing for something higher. Because divine union does not enter a life built on emotional self-abandonment. It enters when the soul finally understands its own sacred value. That is why every heartbreak mattered. Not because you deserved suffering, but because each painful ending pushed you closer toward awakening. Closer toward discernment. Closer toward self-respect. Closer toward alignment. And most importantly, closer toward the love that will no longer require you to lose yourself in order to keep it. Chosen one, by now you have probably realized something unsettling. The closer you moved toward healing, the more resistance seemed to appear in your life. It was almost as if invisible pressure increased every time you began reclaiming your power. You started setting boundaries, and suddenly people became angry. You began protecting your peace, and chaos erupted around you. You started loving yourself more deeply, and certain relationships collapsed without warning. At first, you thought it was coincidence. Then you thought maybe you were overthinking. But after enough patterns repeated themselves, your soul began recognizing something deeper. This journey was never just emotional. It was spiritual. And that is precisely why your divine union became a target. Because this connection was never meant to be ordinary romance. It was designed to awaken both souls. And awakened souls are difficult to control. Think carefully about the systems most people unconsciously live inside every day. Fear, scarcity, emotional dependency, toxic cycles repeated through generations, people settling for survival instead of alignment, people staying in loveless relationships because they fear loneliness, people abandoning themselves just to feel temporarily accepted. Most of the world has normalized emotional disconnection. But divine union threatens those patterns completely. Because true sacred love forces healing. It exposes illusions. It destroys false identities. It reveals wounds people have spent years avoiding. And not everyone is prepared for that level of transformation. That is why resistance often intensifies when a chosen one gets close to alignment. Not because the universe is punishing them, but because old energies begin fighting for survival. You may have noticed this pattern already. Every time you started becoming stronger emotionally, something tried pulling you backward. Old relationships suddenly resurfaced. Past attachments reappeared unexpectedly. People who ignored you suddenly demanded your attention. Emotional confusion increased. Fear became louder. Doubt became stronger. And sometimes, just when you finally felt ready for love, everything around you seemed to fall apart. Chosen one, that is not always failure. Sometimes it is energetic warfare between your future and your past. Because the old version of you cannot enter divine union. The people, habits, and emotional addictions tied to your lower self cannot survive where sacred alignment is growing. And although that transformation is beautiful, it can also feel terrifying. Because healing often looks like destruction before it feels like peace. Some of you lost friendships during awakening. Some lost relationships. Some lost entire versions of their identity. You stopped resonating with environments that once felt normal. Conversations became shallow. Certain people began draining your energy. Places that once comforted you started feeling heavy. And for a while, it felt like your entire life was collapsing. But what if it was actually reorganizing? What if the universe was removing everything that could not coexist with your next chapter? Chosen one, many people misunderstand spiritual warfare. They imagine dramatic external attacks while ignoring the subtle emotional patterns that truly keep souls trapped. Fear is spiritual warfare. Self-hatred is spiritual warfare. Addiction to toxic relationships is spiritual warfare. Believing you are unworthy of healthy love is spiritual warfare. And for years, many chosen ones unknowingly lived inside those patterns. Not because they were weak, but because generational wounds were operating through them unconsciously. Think about the emotional patterns in your family line. Was love connected to sacrifice? Was vulnerability punished? Did people avoid emotional honesty? Did cycles of abandonment, betrayal, control, or emotional distance repeat through generations? Most chosen ones are born into bloodlines carrying unresolved pain. And part of their spiritual mission is to finally break those cycles. That is why your journey feels heavier than ordinary relationships. You are not only healing yourself, you are confronting inherited emotional patterns that existed long before you were born. And that level of healing creates resistance. Because generational trauma does not disappear quietly. It fights to survive. That is why some people around you unconsciously resisted your awakening. Not because they consciously hated you, but because your transformation threatened familiar emotional dynamics. When one person heals, everybody connected to them feels the shift. Some become inspired. Others become uncomfortable. And some attempt to pull the chosen one back into older versions of themselves. Have you noticed how certain people only felt comfortable around you when you were struggling? When you lacked confidence? When you constantly doubted yourself? But the moment you began evolving, they changed toward you? Suddenly they became critical, dismissive, cold, competitive, or emotionally distant. That is because your light exposed what they refused to heal within themselves. And instead of transforming, many people unconsciously attack what triggers their insecurity. Chosen one, not everyone who hurt you was evil. Many were simply wounded. But wounded people can still create enormous damage when they refuse accountability. That is why discernment became necessary on your journey. Because your heart naturally wants to see the good in everyone. You want to understand people's pain. You want to forgive. You want to help. But spiritual maturity teaches an important lesson. Understanding someone's wounds does not mean allowing them unlimited access to your soul. And many chosen ones learned that lesson painfully. You gave endless chances. You tolerated disrespect. You kept trying to save connections that were already draining your spirit. Why? Because part of you feared that walking away made you selfish. But protecting your peace is not selfish. It is sacred responsibility. Especially when your soul is preparing for divine union. Because sacred love cannot fully enter a life crowded with unresolved karmic attachments. The old must collapse first. And yes, sometimes that collapse feels brutal. There are people listening right now who experience sudden endings they never saw coming. Connections that disappeared overnight. Friendships that dissolved without explanation. Situations where people projected hatred onto them for no clear reason. Moments where they questioned their sanity because everything shifted so quickly. But hear this carefully, chosen one. Not every ending was rejection. Some endings were rescue. The universe was separating you from energies that could not accompany you into alignment. And often, the soul recognizes danger long before the conscious mind does. That is why your body became exhausted around certain people. Why anxiety increased around unhealthy environments. Why your intuition screamed even when your emotions wanted to stay. Your spirit knew something your mind had not fully accepted yet. You were outgrowing entire frequencies. And growth always threatens what depends on your stagnation. That includes unhealthy relationships, toxic emotional patterns, and even the wounded identities you once built to survive. Many chosen ones spent years becoming what others needed them to be. The caretaker, the healer, the overgiver, the emotionally available one, the peacemaker. But eventually, your soul became exhausted carrying roles that required self-abandonment. That exhaustion was not weakness. It was spiritual truth finally surfacing. Because the soul cannot endlessly survive in environments disconnected from authenticity. And once your awakening truly began, there was no returning to unconscious living. You started seeing patterns too clearly. You began recognizing manipulation immediately. You could feel energetic dishonesty beneath people's words. And although this heightened awareness sometimes made you feel isolated, it was actually part of your preparation. Your spirit was learning discernment before reunion. Because divine union requires clarity. Not fantasy. Not emotional addiction. Not trauma bonding. Clarity. And clarity changes everything. Suddenly, you no longer chase people who confuse you. You no longer beg for consistency. You no longer interpret emotional chaos as passion. Your soul begins craving peace more than intensity. That shift marks spiritual maturity. And it terrifies people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Chosen one, this next part is important. Some of the greatest attacks against your divine union came through distraction. Not obvious destruction. Distraction. The wrong relationships. The wrong environments. The wrong emotional attachments. The wrong beliefs about your worth. Because if your energy stayed trapped inside survival patterns, you would never fully align with your destiny. So the universe allowed painful lessons to wake you up. Not to destroy you, but to redirect you. And now you are beginning to understand why everything happened the way it did. The betrayals forced discernment. The abandonment forced self-worth. The loneliness forced spiritual connection. The heartbreak forced awakening. None of it was meaningless. Every painful chapter was pushing you toward the version of yourself capable of sustaining sacred love. And although the journey nearly broke you at times, it also transformed you. You are no longer the same person who once accepted confusion as love. You are no longer the version of yourself that begged people to stay. You are no longer asleep to your own value. Now your spirit recognizes truth faster. Now your energy rejects manipulation faster. Now your soul understands that peace is not boring. Peace is alignment. And that realization is precisely why your divine union is getting closer now than ever before. Because what once targeted you is losing power. The old cycles are collapsing. The false attachments are fading. And for the first time in your life, you are becoming emotionally available for the kind of love your soul was always destined to receive. Chosen one, if there is one stage of the twin flame journey that nearly breaks every awakened soul, it is the separation. Because nothing confuses the heart more than feeling a connection so deeply only to watch it disappear. One moment, it feels as though the universe itself brought this person into your life. The connection feels magnetic, unexplainable, familiar in a way that terrifies you. You feel seen emotionally, spiritually, energetically. And for the first time in your life, something inside you whispers, "This is different." But then suddenly everything changes. Communication becomes inconsistent. Distance appears. Fear rises. Misunderstandings multiply. One or both people pull away. And what once felt divinely aligned suddenly becomes painfully uncertain. Chosen one, this is where many souls lose hope. Because separation feels like abandonment. It feels like rejection. It feels like punishment. But what if the separation was never meant to destroy the connection? What if it was designed to transform the people inside it? That changes everything. Because the truth is, most chosen ones meet their twin flame before they are fully healed. The connection activates awakening immediately. Suddenly, buried wounds rise to the surface. Unresolved fears intensify. Emotional triggers become impossible to ignore. And the soul begins confronting everything it spent years suppressing. That process can feel overwhelming. Especially when both people are still carrying pain from childhood, karmic relationships, emotional betrayal, or spiritual confusion. The connection becomes a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable. Because they reveal the parts of ourselves we tried to avoid. That is why so many twin flame separations begin after periods of intense emotional closeness. The soul recognizes the connection before the ego is ready to sustain it. So fear enters. One person may run. The other may chase. Old abandonment wounds activate. Control patterns surface. Silence becomes painful. And suddenly, the relationship starts triggering deep emotional chaos. Not because the connection is false, but because it is exposing everything unhealed. Chosen one, hear this clearly. Separation is not proof that the union failed. Separation is often proof that the awakening succeeded. Because before sacred love can stabilize externally, both souls must confront themselves internally. And that process is rarely comfortable. Think about who you were before this journey began. Many of you were still tolerating emotional breadcrumbs, still seeking validation from people who could not truly love you, still abandoning yourselves to avoid loneliness, still carrying wounds you had normalized for years. Then this connection entered your life and shattered the illusion completely. Suddenly, surface-level relationships no longer satisfied your soul. You became more emotionally aware, more spiritually sensitive, more conscious of energy, and more aware of the ways you had betrayed yourself in the past. The connection awakened your spirit, but awakening is not always peaceful at first. Sometimes awakening feels like grief, because the old version of you begins dying. The identity built around survival, the patterns built around fear, the emotional attachments built around insecurity. All of it starts collapsing during separation. That is why this stage feels so intense. You are not only grieving a person, you are grieving old versions of yourself. And many chosen ones do not realize how much transformation is actually happening during silence. Externally, it may look like nothing is moving, but spiritually, everything is shifting. The separation forces introspection. It forces healing. It forces both souls to stop running from themselves. Some people awaken through closeness. Others awaken through loss. But both paths ultimately lead toward growth. That is why you cannot judge divine union using ordinary relationship logic. Traditional relationships often survive through comfort, distraction, or routine. Twin flame connections survive through transformation. And transformation requires honesty. Deep honesty. The kind of honesty that forces you to confront your fears directly. The fear of rejection. The fear of abandonment. The fear of vulnerability. The fear that love will disappear the moment you fully open your heart. Those wounds existed long before your twin flame arrived. The connection simply illuminated them. That is why blaming yourself entirely for the separation is unfair. You did not create the wounds alone. You inherited some through childhood. Others came through painful relationships. Others developed through years of emotional disappointment. And your twin flame likely carried wounds too. That is the part many chosen ones forget. Both souls are healing. Both souls are awakening. Both souls are learning difficult lessons through this process. Even if one person appears emotionally distant, disconnected, or avoidant externally, it does not mean nothing is happening internally. Soul-level connections continue affecting people even during physical separation. That is why so many chosen ones experience strange synchronicities during this stage. Dreams that feel intensely real. Sudden emotional waves. Hearing songs connected to the person unexpectedly. Repeating numbers appearing constantly. Feeling their energy without physical contact. Thinking about the moments before they reach out. These experiences confuse the logical mind because the bond operates beyond ordinary attraction. The connection becomes energetic before it becomes physical. And sometimes the soul feels reunion approaching long before reality reflects it. But here is where many people unintentionally delay their own healing. They become obsessed with waiting. Obsessed with timelines. Obsessed with signs. Obsessed with reunion itself. Chosen one, divine union was never meant to become emotional imprisonment. The purpose of separation is not to keep you stuck in longing. It is to return you to yourself. That is the lesson many souls resist initially. Because part of the ego wants the connection to fix everything externally. But sacred love cannot complete someone who has abandoned themselves internally. That is why the separation redirects your focus inward. Toward healing, toward purpose, toward self-respect, toward spiritual growth. And ironically, the moment many chosen ones stop obsessively chasing the connection is the moment the energy finally begins stabilizing. Why? Because desperation lowers alignment. Fear lowers alignment. Self-abandonment lowers alignment. But inner peace raises it. Self-love raises it. Emotional wholeness raises it. The universe cannot fully align you with sacred love while you are still abandoning your own spirit, trying to force outcomes. That is why separation becomes sacred preparation. It teaches emotional independence, energetic balance, discernment, patience, faith, and perhaps most importantly, it teaches unconditional love without attachment to control. That lesson transforms the soul completely, because eventually something shifts inside you. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop panicking over silence. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's behavior. And instead, you begin reclaiming your own center. That is when healing accelerates. Not because you stopped loving your twin flame, but because you finally stopped losing yourself inside the connection. There is a massive difference. Chosen one, many of you are currently in the stage where the old emotional identity is collapsing. You can feel it. Things that once triggered panic no longer affect you the same way. You are becoming calmer, more discerning, more grounded spiritually. You are beginning to understand that divine timing is not punishment. It is protection. Because if reunion had happened too early, unresolved wounds could have destroyed the connection entirely. The delay prevented premature collapse. The silence created reflection. The distance created growth. And although your human heart experienced pain, your soul was evolving the entire time. Think about how much stronger you are now compared to when this journey first began. You understand yourself differently. You recognize unhealthy patterns faster. You no longer tolerate the same emotional inconsistency. You have learned boundaries, discernment, self-awareness. And even though the process was painful, you are no longer asleep spiritually. That awakening matters. Because divine union is not simply about romance. It is about evolution. Two souls becoming emotionally, spiritually, and energetically capable of sustaining sacred love without destroying themselves through fear. That level of maturity cannot be rushed. And yes, some connections still require more healing before reunion manifests physically. But never confuse delay with denial. The soul's timing rarely matches the ego's urgency. Sometimes people need additional experiences before they are ready. Sometimes healing occurs in layers. Sometimes both souls must completely dismantle old identities before alignment becomes stable. But none of that means the journey was meaningless. In fact, the separation may become the very thing that saves the union long term. Because it forced both people to evolve. And now, something important is happening. You're beginning to feel less desperate and more aligned. Less fearful and more trusting. Less attached to control and more connected to inner peace. That shift is powerful. Because reunion energy often approaches quietly. Not through emotional chaos, but through spiritual clarity. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you are finally understanding this truth. The separation was never sent to destroy your heart. It was sent to prepare your soul for the kind of love that no longer requires fear, chasing, or self-abandonment to survive. Chosen one, there comes a moment in this journey when something begins to change in the energy. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, unmistakably. After months or even years of confusion, silence, emotional pain, and spiritual transformation, you begin sensing that something is shifting on the other side of the connection too. And the strange part is you often feel it before you can explain it. Because soul connections communicate energetically long before physical reality catches up. That is why so many chosen ones experience periods where they suddenly feel their twin flames. Presence intensely without any external contact. You could be focusing on your daily life, trying to move forward, trying not to think about the connection, and then suddenly their energy floods your awareness out of nowhere. A random memory appears. a wave of emotion hits your chest. You hear a song connected to them unexpectedly. You wake up feeling as though you were just speaking to them in another dimension. And no matter how hard logic tries to dismiss it, your spirit knows something deeper is happening. Chosen one, these moments are not always imagination. Sometimes they are signs of energetic awakening within the connection itself. Because when one soul begins healing deeply, the energetic bond naturally affects the other. Especially in divine union connections. That is why periods of spiritual growth often trigger synchronicities between twin flames. The energy starts recalibrating. Walls begin weakening. Awareness increases. And emotions long suppressed begin rising to the surface. You may notice repeating numbers appearing constantly during this stage. 111, 112, 113, 114. At first, you brush it off as coincidence. But then it happens again. And again. And again. You check the time and see repeating patterns. You encounter their birthday unexpectedly. You hear their name repeatedly in random places. Certain symbols follow you everywhere. And deep inside, your intuition whispers, "Fais attention." Now listen carefully, chosen one. The signs themselves are not the goal. The signs are simply indicators that energetic movement is occurring. Too many people become obsessed with chasing synchronicities while ignoring the deeper spiritual message underneath them. The real purpose of these moments is awakening, alignment, expansion of consciousness. Because divine union is not only about romantic reunion. It is about spiritual activation. And during this phase, many chosen ones begin experiencing heightened intuition unlike anything they felt before. You start sensing emotions that do not fully belong to you. You suddenly feel sadness, longing, anxiety, or love without external reason. At times, it almost feels like someone else's emotional energy is touching your spirit. That experience can feel overwhelming at first, especially if you are naturally empathic. But often, what is happening is energetic resonance within the connection. The bond becomes more active as healing progresses. And the closer both souls move toward alignment, the stronger the energetic communication can become. This is why some chosen ones suddenly dream about their twin flame repeatedly after long periods of silence. Not ordinary dreams. Dreams that feel intensely vivid. Conversations that feel real. Moments filled with emotional clarity. Sometimes you wake up crying. Sometimes you wake up peaceful. Sometimes you wake up feeling their presence so strongly that it almost feels physical. These experiences can leave you questioning your sanity if you try explaining them to people who have never experienced soul-level connection. But your spirit recognizes what your mind struggles to understand. Energy does not require physical distance to remain connected. That is why some of you felt your twin flame thinking about you before they reached out. Why you sensed major shifts in their life without them telling you. Why emotional waves suddenly hit moments before communication reopened. The soul often knows before the ego does. And one of the clearest signs your twin flame is awakening is this. The energy between you starts feeling less chaotic and more reflective. In earlier stages, the connection may have felt overwhelming, triggering, emotionally unstable, filled with chasing, confusion, fear, and imbalance. But as awakening progresses, something subtle changes. You stop feeling constant panic. You stop obsessively needing answers. And strangely, even when separation still exists physically, you begin feeling calmer internally. That calmness is important, because healing stabilizes the connection energetically before it stabilizes externally. Many chosen ones expect reunion energy to feel explosive. But often, true alignment arrives quietly, peacefully, maturely, without the emotional desperation that existed earlier in the journey. That is because both souls are evolving beyond survival patterns. And as this happens, your twin flame may begin experiencing their own awakening symptoms too. Even if they were once emotionally unavailable. Even if they ran from the connection initially. Even if they appeared disconnected spiritually. The soul cannot remain asleep forever once this level of connection activates. Eventually, life begins forcing reflection. Karmic cycles become unbearable. Old coping mechanisms stop working. Emotional distractions lose their power. And the person who once avoided themselves begins confronting emotions they spent years suppressing. This process can happen slowly, painfully, and sometimes privately. That is why chosen ones must stop assuming silence means absence of growth. Many awakenings happen internally long before external behavior changes. Think about your own journey. Did everyone immediately recognize your transformation? No. Most of your deepest healing happened in silence. Late nights, private tears, internal battles nobody saw. And your twin flame may be experiencing similar inner shifts right now. That is why patience matters on this journey. Not passive waiting, but spiritual trust. Because forcing outcomes often interferes with divine timing. You cannot spiritually pressure someone into awakening faster than their soul is ready for. Every soul has its own process, its own fears, its own lessons, its own timeline of surrender. And one of the hardest lessons for chosen ones is learning to trust the unseen movement happening beneath the surface. Because while you're focusing on healing yourself, the universe is often orchestrating changes you cannot yet fully see. Sometimes your twin flame must lose certain relationships before awakening. Sometimes they must confront painful truths. Sometimes they must experience loneliness, karmic collapse, or emotional exhaustion before recognizing the depth of the connection. Not as punishment, but as growth. The soul often awakens through contrast. That is why many people only understand sacred love after experiencing what false love feels like. And if your twin flame has been distant, confused, or avoidant, remember this. Running from the connection does not erase the connection. It only delays the moment they must confront it fully. Because soul recognition cannot be permanently forgotten. Suppressed temporarily? Yes. Ignored for a season? Absolutely. But erased? Never. And eventually life itself begins guiding both souls back toward truth. That is why many chosen ones begin sensing reunion energy before any physical confirmation exists. You suddenly feel hopeful without explanation. You feel emotionally lighter. You feel guided to focus on yourself instead of obsessing over the outcome. Your intuition becomes stronger. Your fear decreases. And strangely, you begin feeling less attached to forcing communication. That energetic detachment is not loss of love. It is emotional balance. And balance creates space for alignment. Because desperate energy often pushes sacred connections away. But grounded energy invites them closer. Chosen one. One of the greatest signs your twin flame is awakening is not actually external communication. It is your own transformation. The calmer you become, the more aligned the connection becomes energetically. The more you heal abandonment wounds, the less fear controls the bond. The more you choose self-respect, the less chaos the connection requires to trigger growth. That is why your healing matters so deeply. You are not only transforming yourself, you are shifting the energetic dynamic of the entire connection. And yes, sometimes you may still experience doubt. Some days your human heart becomes tired. Some days you question whether reunion will truly happen. That is normal. You are still human. But deep down, something inside you already knows this connection changed your life forever. Not because it was perfect, but because it awakened parts of your soul that were sleeping for years. And now the energy is evolving again. The emotional intensity is slowly transforming into spiritual clarity. The confusion is becoming discernment. The obsession is becoming inner peace. The fear is becoming trust. That transformation is sacred. Because divine union cannot be sustained through anxiety and emotional chaos alone. It must eventually mature into stability, into truth, into conscious love. And perhaps that is why you are here listening to this message right now. Because your soul can feel the shift coming. You can sense that something is changing energetically. The old cycles are weakening. The emotional storms are calming. And somewhere, whether near or far, your twin flame may finally be awakening to the same truth your soul has been trying to understand. All along, this connection was never ordinary. It was destined to transform both of you from the inside out. Chosen one of the hardest truths to accept on this journey is that not every enemy in your life arrived looking dangerous. Some arrived smiling. Some arrived pretending to love you. Some arrived pretending to support your healing while secretly benefiting from your confusion. And some people were never consciously trying to destroy you at all. They were simply deeply uncomfortable with the version of you that was beginning to awaken. That realization changes everything. Because for most of your life, you probably believed that bad intentions would be obvious. You thought manipulation would always look cruel. You thought jealousy would always sound hateful. You thought energy drainers would always reveal themselves immediately. But spiritual warfare often operates through subtle emotional dynamics. Guilt, control, fear, emotional dependency, constant criticism disguised as concern. And chosen ones are especially vulnerable to these patterns because your heart naturally wants to understand people instead of judging them. You give people the benefit of the doubt. You try to see their pain. You forgive repeatedly. And while compassion is beautiful, compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. That is why awakening often feels shocking. Because suddenly, you begin seeing people clearly for the first time. The friend who only contacted you when they needed emotional support. The partner who enjoyed your love but resisted your growth. The family members who called you dramatic every time you expressed boundaries. The people who became distant the moment you stopped shrinking yourself to make them comfortable. At first, these realizations hurt deeply. Because you genuinely loved many of these people. You defended them. Excused them. Stayed loyal to them long after they stopped protecting your spirit. But eventually, your soul became too awake to continue ignoring the imbalance. Chosen one, hear this carefully. Not everyone around you is aligned with your evolution. Some people were attached to your wounded version because it benefited them emotionally. When you lacked boundaries, they had access to your energy constantly. When you doubted yourself, they felt more secure around you. When you stayed emotionally exhausted, you were easier to control. But healing changes the energetic dynamic completely. The moment you stop accepting mistreatment, unhealthy people begin feeling uncomfortable around you. Not because you became cruel, but because your energy stopped participating in the old pattern. And this is where many chosen ones become confused. Because the same people who once praised your kindness may suddenly accuse you of changing. The same people who benefited from your overgiving may suddenly call you selfish. The same people who ignored your pain may suddenly become angry when you prioritize your peace. Why? Because your awakening disrupted their access to the version of you they were used to. And not everyone knows how to love a healed person. Some people only know how to connect through dysfunction, through emotional chaos, through dependency, through trauma bonding. That is why certain relationships became heavier as your awakening deepened. Your soul started rejecting dynamics that once felt normal. You could feel manipulation faster. You could sense dishonesty beneath people's words. Your body began reacting to energy your mind once ignored. Have you noticed that recently? Some conversations leave you exhausted instantly. Some environments feel emotionally suffocating. Some people drain your spirit even when they are being outwardly pleasant. That sensitivity is not weakness. It is awareness. Your spirit is learning energetic discernment. And discernment is essential before divine union. Because sacred love cannot survive in a life crowded with people who continuously pull you away from alignment. That is why the universe began exposing hidden enemies during your awakening. Not necessarily enemies in the traditional sense, but people, patterns, and environments that could no longer accompany you into your next chapter. And yes, some of these revelations felt heartbreaking, especially when the people involved were family. Chosen ones often carry deep wounds connected to family misunderstanding. Many of you grew up feeling emotionally unseen. You were the sensitive one, the different one, the one who questioned unhealthy dynamics instead of pretending everything was normal. And because of that, some families projected their unresolved pain onto you. Not because you were wrong, but because truth disrupts dysfunction. When one person begins healing inside a wounded family system, the entire system reacts. Some people awaken, others resist, and some unconsciously attack the person who is changing because their growth exposes what everyone else has avoided confronting. That is why many chosen ones felt isolated during awakening. You started seeing patterns nobody wanted to discuss. You noticed manipulation hidden beneath love. You recognized emotional cycles repeating across generations. And while part of you wanted to keep the peace, another part of you could no longer pretend unconscious behavior was healthy. That internal conflict became exhausting. Because chosen ones often carry enormous empathy. You understand people's trauma. You understand why they became the way they are. But eventually, spiritual maturity teaches an important lesson. Understanding someone's pain does not require sacrificing your own peace to accommodate it forever. That lesson is difficult for awakened souls, especially those who spent years becoming caretakers for everyone around them. Many of you became emotional rescuers early in life. You learned to anticipate other people's moods. You learned to calm tension. You learned to overgive in order to maintain connection. And unconsciously, you began attracting relationships where people expected you to carry emotional responsibility for them. But now something inside you is changing. You're becoming tired of saving people who refuse to save themselves. Tired of explaining your worth. Tired of shrinking your truth to avoid making others uncomfortable. That exhaustion is not bitterness. It is spiritual graduation. Because your soul is finally realizing it cannot fulfill its divine purpose while constantly leaking energy into people committed to remaining unconscious. And perhaps the hardest enemy to recognize was not always other people. Sometimes the enemy was the wounded voice inside yourself. The voice that told you to tolerate disrespect because you feared abandonment. The voice that convinced you to stay in unhealthy situations because you hoped love would eventually heal them. The voice that whispered you were too much whenever you expressed emotional needs. Chosen ones often internalize years of rejection until self-abandonment becomes automatic. You apologize for things that are not your fault. You over-explain your feelings. You fear setting boundaries because you worry people will leave. And that inner fear becomes one of the greatest blocks to alignment. Because divine union cannot fully manifest while you are still betraying yourself emotionally. That is why healing required confronting your own unconscious patterns too. Not to shame yourself, but to free yourself. Because once you become aware of the patterns, they begin losing power over you. And slowly you start changing. You stop chasing unavailable people. You stop begging for bare minimum effort. You stop tolerating emotional inconsistency disguised as love. You stop confusing chemistry with alignment. And as this transformation happens, many people naturally fall away from your life. Not because you hate them, but because your frequency no longer matches. That is one of the loneliest stages of awakening. You outgrow people before your new soul-aligned connections fully arrive. For a season, it can feel like you belong nowhere. Old environments feel heavy. Old conversations feel meaningless. Even certain entertainment, habits, or routines stop resonating. You are spiritually shedding an old identity. And shedding always feels uncomfortable before rebirth begins. Chosen one, there is something important you must understand about this stage. Isolation is not always punishment. Sometimes it is protection. The universe will often remove distractions before alignment appears. Because silence sharpens discernment. Distance restores clarity. And solitude reconnects you to your own soul. That is why many chosen ones experience intense loneliness right before major breakthroughs. The old attachments are dissolving. The false identities are collapsing. The emotional dependencies are breaking. And although it feels painful, your spirit is actually preparing for a higher level of love and purpose. Think about who you were a few years ago. Would that version of you have recognized manipulation as quickly as you do now? Would that version of you have walked away from draining situations? Would that version of you have chosen peace over emotional chaos? Probably not, because healing changed your standards. Not only in relationships, but in energy. Now your soul craves authenticity, consistency, emotional safety, spiritual truth. And that shift threatens people who only know how to connect through dysfunction. That is why some individuals disappeared when you started awakening. Not everyone can accompany you into alignment. And although part of your heart still grieves certain losses, your spirit already knows the truth. Some people were chapters, not destinations. Some people entered your life to trigger growth, not permanence. And some connections had to end because they were keeping you emotionally attached to lower versions of yourself. That is not cruelty. That is divine redirection. Because your soul was never meant to remain trapped inside cycles of exhaustion, confusion, and emotional survival. You were meant to awaken. You were meant to heal. You were meant to break patterns your bloodline normalized for generations. And most importantly, you were meant to finally understand that protecting your peace is not rejection of others. It is acceptance of your own sacred value. Chosen one, if your life has felt strange lately, this message is going to explain why. Because many of you are no longer standing in the old version of your reality, but you have not fully entered the new one yet. And that space in between can feel deeply unsettling. It feels like something is ending, even if you cannot explain exactly what. The people around you may think you are simply changing, but your soul knows this transformation is far deeper than that. You are experiencing a divine shift, a spiritual transition that begins internally long before it becomes visible externally. That is why so many chosen ones lately feel emotionally detached from things they once desperately wanted. Conversations that used to excite you now feel empty. Places that once felt familiar now feel energetically heavy. Relationships that once consumed your thoughts no longer affect you the same way. And perhaps most confusing of all, you are starting to outgrow identities you spent years building. That process can feel terrifying, because human beings naturally seek certainty. We want clear answers, clear direction, clear timelines. But spiritual transformation rarely unfolds that way. Most awakenings begin in darkness, in uncertainty, in endings. And many chosen ones mistakenly think their lives are falling apart during the very season they are actually being elevated. Chosen one, listen carefully. The collapse happening around you is not always destruction. Sometimes it is divine reorganization. Because the universe cannot bring sacred alignment into a life still built around emotional survival. The old foundation must break first. And yes, that breaking process can feel brutal. Some of you have experienced sudden endings recently that made no logical sense. Unexpected distance from people you once felt close to. Emotional exhaustion without clear explanation. Moments where you questioned your purpose entirely. You tried returning to old routines, old relationships, old coping mechanisms, but nothing fits anymore. That feeling is not failure. It is spiritual expiration. Your soul is no longer compatible with certain frequencies. And once awakening reaches a certain level, pretending becomes impossible. You can no longer force yourself to tolerate environments that drain your spirit. You can no longer ignore your intuition for the sake of temporary comfort. You can no longer survive on surface-level connections when your soul craves depth and truth. That realization changes everything. But before your new reality fully forms, there is often a painful transition stage. A season where you feel disconnected from both the old and the new. This is where many chosen ones become discouraged. Because externally, it may appear like nothing is working. Plans change unexpectedly. People disappear. Emotions intensify. Life feels unstable. But spiritually, massive shifts are occurring beneath the surface. Think about nature for a moment. Before a seed becomes a tree, it first disappears beneath the soil. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But internally, transformation has already begun. Roots are forming. Growth is preparing. Expansion is unfolding invisibly. And spiritually, many of you are in that exact stage right now. You are becoming someone new internally before external reality catches up. That is why your intuition has become stronger recently. You can sense energy immediately. You notice hidden intentions faster. You feel emotionally guided away from certain people or environments without needing logical explanation. Some of you are even experiencing heightened synchronicities during this season. Repeating numbers, vivid dreams, sudden intuitive downloads, strange feelings of certainty about things you cannot yet physically prove. These moments are signs that your consciousness is expanding. You are becoming more aligned with your higher self. And as that alignment deepens, the old illusions begin collapsing naturally. That includes false relationships, false ambitions, false identities. And although the ego fears this process, the soul recognizes it as liberation. Chosen one, many people are addicted to familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. That is why some stay in relationships that destroy them emotionally. That is why some remain trapped in cycles they secretly hate. Because uncertainty feels scarier than suffering they already know. But awakening forces you beyond familiarity. Your spirit begins demanding authenticity. And authenticity often requires endings. Not because you are cursed, but because misalignment can no longer sustain itself around awakened energy. That is why your emotional world may feel unusually intense lately. You are releasing years of suppressed energy, grief, fear, anger, disappointment, loneliness. All the emotions you buried just to survive are finally surfacing to be healed. And healing does not always feel peaceful at first. Sometimes healing feels like emotional chaos before clarity arrives. Some days you feel empowered. Other days you feel exhausted. Some moments you trust the journey deeply. Other moments you wonder if you are losing yourself entirely. That emotional fluctuation is normal during spiritual rebirth. Because the old self resists dissolution. Your ego wants certainty, control, immediate answers. But the soul operates through surrender, faith, alignment. And one of the greatest lessons chosen ones must learn is how to trust transformation before physical evidence appears. That requires spiritual maturity. Because true faith is not believing after everything works out. It is remaining aligned while reality still looks uncertain. And many of you are being tested in exactly that area right now. Will you return to old patterns out of fear? Will you settle for temporary comfort just because transformation feels lonely? Will you abandon your awakening because the process became uncomfortable? Or will you trust that your soul did not come this far to be abandoned now? Chosen one, you did not survive all those painful lessons just to return to emotional survival. You are being prepared for elevation, prepared for alignment, prepared for divine union. But before sacred love arrives fully, your spirit must become stable enough to receive it without self-destruction. That is why emotional purification is happening now. The universe is exposing every remaining attachment rooted in fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being chosen, fear of uncertainty. And each time those fears rise, you are being given another opportunity to heal them consciously instead of repeating old cycles. Unconsciously. That is the real shift happening right now. You are no longer reacting the same way you once did. Have you noticed that? Situations that previously would have destroyed you emotionally now affect you differently. You still feel pain, but you recover faster. You still experience uncertainty, but you trust yourself more deeply. You still miss people, but you no longer abandon your worth to keep them. That growth is sacred. Because healing is not becoming emotionless. Healing is learning not to betray yourself emotionally every time fear appears. And that lesson changes your entire energetic frequency. The more you heal, the less chaos you tolerate. The more you awaken, the less attracted you become to emotionally unavailable people. The more aligned you become internally, the more your external reality begins rearranging itself naturally. That rearrangement is happening now. Some of you are being redirected professionally. Others are relocating physically. Others are ending karmic relationships. Others are discovering spiritual gifts they ignored for years. And some are finally realizing that their entire identity was built around pleasing others instead of honoring themselves. That realization can feel painful at first, but it is also freeing. Because once you stop living for external validation, your soul finally has space to breathe. And when the soul can finally breathe, alignment accelerates. That is why many chosen ones feel both exhausted and hopeful at the same time lately. Part of you is grieving the old world, but another part of you can already feel the new reality approaching. You sense it during quiet moments, during periods of stillness, during random flashes of peace that appear without explanation. Your spirit knows something is changing, even if your physical reality has not fully caught up yet. Chosen one, this next chapter of your life cannot be entered carrying the same fears that controlled your past. That is why the universe is purging them now. Not to punish you, but to free you. Because divine union is not built upon desperation. It is built upon alignment. And alignment requires truth. Truth about your wounds. Truth about your patterns. Truth about the people you allowed access to your spirit. Truth about the ways you abandoned yourself trying to earn love. All of that is surfacing now because your soul is preparing for something higher. You are not crazy for feeling different. You are not broken because old environments no longer fit. You are not lost because the path ahead still feels unclear. You are transforming. And transformation always feels uncomfortable before it becomes beautiful. The old cycle is ending. The karmic weight is dissolving. The emotional confusion is clearing. And somewhere deep inside yourself, you can already feel it. The divine shift is no longer coming. It has already begun. Chosen one, after everything you have survived, everything you have lost, everything you have questioned, there is one truth your soul is finally ready to hear. This connection was never sent into your life just to give you romance. It was sent to awaken you. That is the revelation many people miss when they first enter the twin flame journey. They believe the purpose is simply reunion, physical union, a relationship, a love story. And yes, love is part of it, but the deeper purpose is transformation. Because divine union is not only about finding another person. It is about becoming the version of yourself capable of embodying unconditional love without losing your identity in the process. That is why this journey changed you so dramatically. Think about who you were before this connection activated. You were surviving emotionally, seeking validation externally, repeating unconscious patterns, accepting relationships that slowly drained your spirit, trying to earn love by overgiving, trying to avoid abandonment by betraying yourself first. But the moment this soul entered your life, something ancient awakened inside you. Suddenly, ordinary relationships no longer satisfied your soul. Surface-level conversations became exhausting. Emotional dishonesty became unbearable. And for the first time in your life, your spirit began craving something real. Something sacred. Something beyond ego, games, and temporary attachment. That awakening was not accidental. Because your twin flame was never meant to simply comfort your old self. They were meant to activate your higher self. And higher consciousness always requires the death of illusion. That is why this journey felt so painful at times. The connection exposed every false belief you carried about yourself. Every abandonment wound. Every insecurity. Every fear. Every survival pattern hidden beneath your relationships. And although part of you wanted the connection to immediately become peaceful and permanent, the soul knew healing had to happen first. Because divine union cannot be built on unhealed fear. It must be built on truth. Chosen one. This is the moment where many awakened souls begin understanding the deeper mission behind the connection. Your union is not only personal, it is generational, spiritual, transformational. You were chosen to break cycles your bloodline normalized for decades. Cycles of emotional unavailability, cycles of self-abandonment, cycles of toxic love disguised as loyalty, cycles where people remain trapped inside survival instead of awakening. That is why your journey felt heavier than ordinary relationships. You were never only healing for yourself. You were healing inherited emotional pain carried across generations. And that level of healing changes entire energetic timelines. Think about the patterns that existed in your family before you awakened. How many people stayed silent instead of emotionally honest? How many settled for relationships without genuine intimacy? How many carried hidden pain their entire lives because vulnerability felt unsafe? Those patterns did not begin with you, but your soul volunteered to confront them. That is why your awakening became so intense. Because breaking generational cycles requires enormous spiritual courage. And many chosen ones underestimate how powerful that mission truly is. You thought you were simply trying to survive heartbreak. But in reality, your soul was dismantling inherited emotional programming that existed long before you were born. That is why the connection triggered you so deeply. It was activating the areas that still required liberation. And yes, sometimes that process nearly broke you. There were nights you felt abandoned by the universe itself. Moments where confusion consumed you completely. Moments where you questioned whether the connection was even real. But despite everything, you kept awakening. You kept growing. You kept evolving. Even when part of you wanted to give up. That persistence was not weakness. It was destiny pulling you toward alignment. Because your soul recognized something your logical mind could not fully explain yet. This connection carried purpose. Not fantasy. Purpose. And purpose changes the meaning of everything you experienced. Suddenly, the delays make sense. The separation makes sense. The heartbreak makes sense. The karmic relationships make sense. Every painful chapter was preparing you for a higher level of consciousness. Because sacred love requires emotional maturity, not emotional dependency. That is one of the biggest revelations of this journey. Many people believe love means finding someone who completes them. But divine union teaches something entirely different. It teaches wholeness first. The soul must become emotionally responsible for itself before sacred partnership can stabilize. That is why separation became necessary. Not to punish you, but to force both souls inward, toward healing, toward accountability, toward spiritual growth. And now you are beginning to understand why chasing never worked, why forcing timelines never worked, why begging for clarity never brought peace. Because the universe was trying to redirect your attention back toward yourself, toward your own healing, toward your own mission, toward your own soul. Chosen one, many of you are finally reaching the stage where love no longer feels like desperation. And that shift is enormous. You still care deeply. You still feel the connection. But you are no longer willing to destroy yourself emotionally just to maintain attachment. That is spiritual maturity. Because true divine union is not built through fear of losing each other. It is built through alignment. Two souls choosing each other consciously, not from wounds but from wholeness. And the more you heal, the more your understanding of love transforms completely. You stop craving intensity without stability. You stop romanticizing emotional chaos. You stop confusing anxiety with passion. Instead, your soul begins craving peace, honesty, consistency, presence. And that shift is evidence your energy is aligning with sacred partnership rather than karmic attachment. That is why the universe removed so many people from your life. Not because you were unworthy, but because your soul could no longer survive on fragmented love. You were being prepared for something higher, something honest, something spiritually aligned. And now the connection itself is evolving too. The energy between you and your twin flame is no longer only about triggering wounds. It is beginning to move toward conscious recognition, toward spiritual clarity, toward understanding. Some of you can already feel this shift internally. The panic is decreasing. The obsession is weakening. The emotional desperation is dissolving. And in its place something calmer is emerging. Trust. Not blind fantasy. Not unhealthy attachment. But deep inner knowing. The kind of knowing that does not need constant external proof to exist. Because your soul finally understands that what is divinely aligned cannot be destroyed by temporary distance. Delayed? Yes. Misunderstood? Absolutely. But destroyed? Never. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. This journey was never about losing yourself in another person. It was about finding yourself through sacred reflection. Your twin flame acted as a catalyst, a mirror, a spiritual activator. But the true destination was always awakening. That is why your intuition has become stronger. Why your standards have changed. Why your soul no longer tolerates emotional dishonesty. Why your spirit craves peace more than validation. You are no longer the same person who entered this journey. And you were never meant to remain that version of yourself forever. Chosen one, there is a reason everything feels different now. The old cycle is ending. You can feel it internally. The fear-based version of love is collapsing. The self-abandonment is dissolving. The emotional addiction to suffering is weakening. And for the first time, your soul is beginning to understand what sacred love actually means. Sacred love does not ask you to shrink. It does not demand self-betrayal. It does not survive through manipulation, confusion, or emotional inconsistency. Sacred love expands you. It heals you. It awakens you. It calls you into your highest self. And perhaps that is why this journey had to unfold exactly the way it did. Because if reunion had happened before awakening, you might have mistaken the connection for ordinary romance. But now you understand. This was never ordinary. This was divine. Not because it was perfect, but because it transformed your consciousness forever. And now, chosen one, you stand at the edge of an entirely new chapter. No longer asleep. No longer chasing illusions. No longer willing to settle for love that requires abandoning your own soul. You have survived the karmic cycles. You have survived the spiritual tests. You have survived the separation. And through all of it, something extraordinary happened. You awakened into the truth. That your divine union was never sent merely to make you feel loved. It was sent to remind you who you truly are. Chosen one, if you have made it this far, then your soul was meant to hear this final message. Because something powerful is happening right now. Not only within this journey, but within you. For so long, you searched outside yourself for confirmation. You searched for signs, for answers, for reassurance that the pain meant something, that the separation had purpose, that the connection was real. But after everything you have survived, your spirit is finally beginning to understand something deeper. The greatest confirmation was never outside you. It was the transformation happening within you all along. Look at how much you have changed. You are not the same person who once begged for bare minimum love. You are not the same soul who confused emotional chaos with destiny. You are not the same wounded version of yourself that abandoned personal truth just to avoid loneliness. That version of you had to dissolve. Not because you were weak, but because your spirit was preparing for rebirth. And rebirth always requires release. Release of old identities, old fears, old attachments, old stories about your worth. Chosen one, there were moments during this journey when you truly believed you would never recover. Moments where the silence felt unbearable. Moments where the emotional pain became so heavy that you questioned everything. You questioned the connection. You questioned yourself. You questioned whether the universe had abandoned you completely. But despite all of that, you are still here. Still healing. Still awakening. Still searching for truth instead of returning to unconsciousness. That matters more than you realize. Because many souls spend entire lifetimes running from awakening. They choose distraction instead of healing. Comfort instead of transformation. Illusion instead of truth. But your soul chose differently. Even when it hurt. Even when it cost you relationships. Even when it forced you to walk alone for seasons you never expected. You continued evolving. And now the universe is asking you one final question. Are you ready to stop identifying with the pain and finally step into alignment? Because many chosen ones unconsciously become attached to suffering. Not intentionally. But after years of heartbreak, struggle can start feeling familiar. The wounded self becomes an identity. You begin expecting abandonment. Expecting disappointment. Expecting delay. And without realizing it, fear quietly shapes your energy. But your soul is outgrowing that identity now. You are no longer the abandoned version of yourself. You are no longer the emotionally powerless version of yourself. You are no longer the soul begging to be chosen while secretly doubting your own worth. That chapter is ending. And the reason it feels uncomfortable is because transformation always requires surrender. The ego wants guarantees before trust. But the soul learns trust before guarantees arrive. That is the final activation happening now. You are learning to trust your alignment even before physical reality fully reflects it. That is true spiritual maturity. Chosen one, listen carefully to what your spirit has been trying to tell you. The delays did not destroy you. The separation did not destroy you. The betrayals did not destroy you. In fact, every painful chapter revealed how powerful your soul truly is. Because despite everything, you still chose love. Not naive love. Not self-sacrificing love. But conscious love. The kind of love rooted in truth. And that changes your entire frequency. Many of you can already feel it internally. You are no longer chasing the connection with the same desperation. You are no longer obsessed with forcing outcomes. You still care deeply, but your energy is calmer now. More grounded. More trusting. And ironically, that energetic stability is what brings alignment closer. Because divine union cannot fully enter a nervous system addicted to fear. Sacred love requires emotional safety within yourself first. That is why healing became the true mission all along. Not punishment. Preparation. Everything was preparing you to hold love without losing yourself inside it. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you are beginning to understand the difference between attachment and alignment. Attachment says, I need this person to complete me. Alignment says, I honor this connection without abandoning myself. That shift is enormous. Because once your soul reaches that level of awareness, karmic cycles begin collapsing rapidly. You stop tolerating emotionally unavailable people. You stop chasing validation. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain unhealthy relationships. And suddenly, your entire reality begins changing. Not because you forced it, but because your frequency changed first. That is how divine union truly begins. Internally. Before external reunion ever manifests physically, the soul enters energetic harmony with itself. And many of you are finally reaching that stage now. You are beginning to love yourself differently. Speak to yourself differently. Protect your energy differently. Your standards are changing. Your intuition is sharper. Your peace matters more than external approval. And because of that, the old reality can no longer hold you the same way it once did. Chosen one, this next season of your life will require courage. Not the courage to chase love, but the courage to receive it. That sounds simple, but for wounded souls, receiving healthy love can feel terrifying at first. Because chaos feels familiar. Struggle feels familiar. Overgiving feels familiar. But peace, consistency, emotional safety, that may feel unfamiliar initially. And your final healing lesson is learning not to run from what is finally aligned. That applies not only to divine union, but to your entire life, your purpose, your abundance, your spiritual gifts, your voice, your authenticity. For years, fear convinced you to hide pieces of yourself from the world. Fear taught you survival. But now your soul is learning embodiment. You are learning to exist fully without apologizing for your depth, without minimizing your intuition, without abandoning your truth to fit into spaces that no longer resonate with your spirit. That is liberation. And liberation changes everything. Because once a chosen one truly accepts their worth, their entire energetic field transforms. The desperation dissolves. The fear weakens. The confusion clears. And suddenly, the soul becomes magnetic to aligned experiences naturally. Not because of manipulation, not because of obsession, but because authenticity itself carries powerful frequency. That is why many of you are beginning to notice unexpected shifts happening lately. New opportunities appearing. Old cycles ending. People from the past resurfacing. Strange synchronicities increasing. Moments of deep peace arriving unexpectedly. The universe is responding to your transformation. The inner shift is beginning to create outer movement. And yes, some of you are closer to reunion than you realize. But hear this clearly. Do not measure your progress only through physical outcomes. The true miracle already happened. You awakened. You broke cycles that controlled your bloodline for generations. You learned discernment. You reclaimed your self-worth. You stopped abandoning yourself for temporary love. That transformation alone changed your destiny permanently. And now your soul is no longer operating from fear-based survival. It is operating from conscious alignment. That is why your future cannot resemble your past anymore. You have evolved beyond it. Chosen one. This final chapter is not about convincing you that everything will happen exactly when or how your ego expects. It is about reminding you that your journey was never meaningless. Every tear carried purpose. Every ending carried redirection. Every separation carried transformation. And every painful lesson carried awakening. Nothing was wasted. Not the heartbreak. Not the loneliness. Not the silence. Not even the moments where you felt completely lost. Because all of it was leading you back toward yourself. Toward truth. Toward alignment. Toward the version of you capable of sustaining sacred love without fear controlling the connection. And now, as this chapter closes, your spirit is being invited into something new. No longer chasing. No longer begging. No longer doubting your worth. But standing fully inside your own divine energy. That is the real reunion beginning now. The reunion between you and your authentic soul. And from that place of wholeness, peace, and alignment, everything meant for you will arrive naturally. So if this message resonated deeply with your spirit, let this moment become your final activation. No more shrinking. No more settling. No more abandoning yourself for temporary attachment. You have survived too much to return to emotional survival now. Comment below. I accept my divine union. And if you are ready to release every karmic cycle that once convinced you to doubt your destiny, type 777. Because your next chapter does not begin with fear anymore. It begins with awakening.